And I'm happy to be here with my
Let's do a
friend,
welcome, Pinchas.
Rabbi Aubrey Glazer. And please now, and under the auspices of Panui, and maybe in the course of the evening, you'll explain what that is.
Wonderful. Welcome to everyone, and especially to my dear friend and interlocutor, Pinchas Giller. It's great to be here with you and our friends at Dear Nistar. It's great to be able to collaborate across space and time together, and it's really wonderful to welcome all of you who are joining us as well in different times and different places. So welcome to one and all. Tonight Pinchas and I wanted to have a conversation that really began many moons ago and revolves around a question that we want to look at together tonight, which is why it was actually that Leonard Cohen left the tranquility of his Hydra retreat the day after the beginning of the Yom Kippur War, October 6, 1973. And we thought it would be a great way to culminate the celebration of Hanukkah, known as Zot Hanukkah, because of course everyone in Israel, and especially the early Zionists, love the story of the Maccabees, and we thought it would be an interesting way to retell the different inner stories of Leonard Cohen's strange journey that come up usually in the time relating to Yom Kippur, but it was something that we wanted to do relating to Hanukkah to bring out a little bit more light behind the story, and also the personal journeys to and from Israel that Pinchas and I have had, especially the encounters with Leonard Cohen, and what this song that encapsulates this journey, Lover, 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 might mean in terms of its relationship to that journey. So welcome one and all. And we're going to just take a little bit of a dive into this remarkable song, which I'm sure all of you can hear singing along with your favorite songs that you have in Leonard Cohen's songbook. This is one of them that really is a favorite. So it's October 6, 1973. Egypt and Syria attack Israel on Yom Kippur. The question is, why did Cohen leave his writing colony in Hydra to go to Tel Aviv the day after? He said in some interviews, "I will go and stop Egypt's bullet, trumpets, and a curtain of razor blades. I've never disguised the fact that I'm Jewish. In any crisis, in Israel, I would be there. I'm committed to the survival of the Jewish people." And then, of course, he said, in his own inimitable way, "Women only let you get out of the house for two reasons: to make money or to fight a war." So apparently this was his tongue-in-cheek way of saying that he just had to go. It was something that was a burning need inside of him, and it led to really one of the most remarkable creations that was kind of a stream of consciousness for him. Most of his material that he wrote, as you know, in that Pacific Coast Highway journey with Bob Dylan, when he turned to Dylan and said, "I really love that song that you sing called I and I, how long did it take you to write it?" Remember, Dylan said about 15 minutes. And then when he turned to Leonard and said, "That song you wrote called Hallelujah, I really love it. How long did it take you to write it?" And he lied and said it took him only about 7 years. But we know that Cohen was constantly writing and rewriting. But this song, Lover, 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 was one of the only ones that really came to him kind of like Beruach HaKodesh, in a fit of divine inspiration over about 8 hours or 10 hours of touring with the troops. And
What's that?
and I wanted to share with you the one of the comments that Susan Elrod made. And if folks could just mute for now. Pinchas and I are going to talk for a bit, and then we'll take some Q&A afterwards.
Yeah, this is his wife.
Right. So take a look at some of the pictures. This is what she said.
And not the Suzanne of the song Suzanne. That's another Suzanne, famously.
Right. There's a lot of Suzannes going on here, right, Pinchas?
Yeah, I'm just pointing these things out as a general.
Okay. So she said, "I felt proud about Leonard's heritage and about Leonard's heroic actions and acts of generosity, but fear about something happening. There was much hostility at that time, which turned into a fear of loss and dread of the worst. Knowing his mind couldn't be changed, I remember putting a blue ribbon inside his breast pocket and telling him so that in my mind he'd be safe. And I was truly praying for those first days. So, Pinchas, maybe this is a good time for us as we turn to continue on in this journey. If you want to share um, your first encounter with um, with Leonard, and specifically that concert in Binyanei Ha'oma, and then
Well,
we'll take a
I
look at
was
some of the words here as well. Does that sound like a
no, actually, no. Culturally, I was familiar with him from when his first album came out, and he was immediately canonized in the summer camps um, as a kind of part of our canon of Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Leonard Cohen, and his Judaic content, especially in the volume "The Spice Box of the Earth," was very central to sensitive adolescent mating rituals of the late 60s among Jewish kids. So definitely, and that was, of course, what he was intending it for. So it was, as they say in the Talmud, toho kavaro. It was internally consistent that should be it. And so when I saw him in an enormous concert in Israel in 1972, where he unfortunately made an error of judgment and turned up to the stage high on LSD, and then had to stop the concert and leave for a while, and so on and so forth. And people had traveled for 12 hours from the farthest reaches of Israel to get to this concert. And then all of a sudden he sort of walked off stage, but he collected himself and we all sang Havenu Shalom Aleichem. And then he returned and gave a rather good concert with one of his greatest bands. But
but that was also when the other side of the story was at least the forward facing part in terms of inner stories and inner lights of Cohen. While that was going on, he infamously or inimitably mentioned that he felt like he had to go off stage because the divine masculine and feminine were not in alignment tonight. And when you're in Jerusalem, if the masculine and the feminine are not aligned, according to the Kabbalistic masters, it's not a good thing. So I'm going to go off and meditate and come back after some regrouping, and that led to Havenu Shalom Aleichem on Binyanei Ha'oma. If you can imagine, what was the energy like when he came back out and you were singing that all
well,
together?
everybody was really happy, and he was happy, and he sat on the floor and just enjoyed it for a moment. And then he played his, collected himself and played, I guess, a rather standard concert. It was very nice. He sang the song Chelsea Hotel, which hadn't been on any album yet, so that was engrossing, and it was a slightly different version. Now we know that it's been extensively documented. So yeah, but back to Lover, 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 which is your viewing is. I always thought it was about relationships, but you're finding a larger, quality in it. So what is that?
Well, it's an interesting question because Matti Freidman now just came out with a book in Israel in Hebrew where he reviews kind of like a song exploder approach to this and looks at each and every verse, but also goes back to those opening photos that we looked at in terms of how this was a really unique moment in Cohen's trajectory in terms of his creative process, and also one of the few explicit times where he's really reflecting on his relationship both as a lover, of course, because everything comes back down to relationships, but also what it means to be at war, and how to see that in the context of the search for the beloved. So there's a version here that I oftentimes like to share. It's with him and Laura Branigan, 1976 on French television. But what I wanted to do was actually to share with you a another layer of this. Everyone's familiar with the song, but what's interesting is that some of the pieces of the song were actually changed. We know the lyrics were written and rewritten a number of times. In one of the original iterations, the line read that verse, "I saw my brothers fighting in the desert with fear and with filth and cowardice and shame." And he moves from that shift of looking at the brothers fighting in the desert, and shifts the address towards his father, which is really interesting, and maybe one of the only other times where I think this really comes up in a deep way is in the story of Isaac, which every Israeli knows is one of the most generative stories of the binding of Isaac. Every parent who sends their child out to war, or really sends them out into the IDF as part of the process of their own formation, knows firsthand what this experience of the Akedah is of
Well,
Abraham and Isaac.
I would say that in the third grade in Israeli elementary schools, the week and the day that they study the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, there's notes go out to the parents and follow-ups happen, and it's often very traumatic. And that these are kids at the age of 7 and 8. So that's when it sort of really begins to assert itself. And also, of course, the great unresolvedness of the story in Leonard Cohen's version of it. And it was obviously in context in 1968 or 69, it was clearly an anti-war, polemic in the spirit of the times.
Story of Isaac, right? So I brought it up because I think it's paradigmatic. But here, this really, because of the backstory of how he composed it and also how it changed the more that he played it. It's interesting again to see how he interweaves these different pieces of scripture that he knew well, that were part of the canvas on which he was the palette in which he was painting this canvas. There were resonances of the Book of Lamentations, but also further on from there was a sense that he was seeking some way to be able to try and find a way in his own wanderings that come up later on in the Book of Mercy, where he goes back to these moments where the covenant is broken and unbroken. Marcia Pally, in her new book, she spends a lot of time focusing on the covenantal relationships, both interpersonal as well as between the singer and God, as being something that are of constant concern for Leonard. And of course, this is a big question when you go to war in society, and how you are able to navigate what the covenantal relationship is. And he, I think, was struggling with that a lot, in much of his life. He says in Book of Mercy 27, the covenant is broken, the condition is dishonored. Have you not noticed that the world has been taken away? You have no place, you will wander through yourselves from generation to generation without a thread, and therefore you rule over chaos. You hoist your flags with no authority, and the heart that is still alive hates you, and the remnant of mercy is ashamed to look at you. So this is later on, this is 84, when he's already divorced and in need of trying to get access to his kids. I think he's living in some kind of an RV situation at the bottom of a French tower, where his partner is living, and just really trying to come to terms with who he is and where he is in his life, and the sense of covenants being broken and unbroken. But the spirit of the song, may it rise up and free you, may it be a shield for you against the enemy. It's interesting that when he sings this much later on, for the concert in 2009 in Tel Aviv, for example, he concludes the concert by intoning the Birkat Kohanim, which later on in his journey, he returns to take on that mantle of his kehuna and his priesthood. And it's interesting, earlier on, we could say maybe he was taking on, especially after the writers' conference at the Jewish Public Library in 1964, where he really announced himself as kind of being an anarchic prophet who was castigating all of his elders, both within the Jewish world and that were very ensconced in the orthodoxy and the Zionist establishments of the day in Montreal that he was a part of. He sometimes shifts between being the prophet calling out and castigating and critiquing, and then moving back towards the mantle of the priest. And it's interesting
Aubrey,
how
can
both of them come out inside of the song. Yeah, go ahead, Pinchas.
let me just dial back a little bit. Could you tell people about the Book of Mercy? Because this is a sort of a sleeper that has really achieved a kind of a low-key canonical status, and it has 50 entries, does
It
it? Or
does. Yeah, it
yes,
has.
so
It's a
people read
very
it
interesting
during
little book. He wrote it in
people read it
'84.
during the counting of the Omer. But go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, which is a really great way to adopt it. People have different practices. You're right, it is kind of like a little bit of a cult classic, but it's basically 50 of his own contemporary psalms that he wrote while he reached the 50th year of his life, and was asking himself, where am I, and what is it that I'm really here deployed to do as a measly singer and songwriter and poet. So it's a powerful self-reflective text that really opens up with the kind of power that we would expect from him in some of his greatest songwriting. I think it's one of the greatest pieces that he's written. And you're right, it is kind of a bit of a sleeper, but it's extremely powerful as a text, and really kind of takes us into the heart of the poet himself. And going back to just some of the other images that come up in Lover, Lover, Lover. Of course, again, I think a lot of it has to do with Lamentations, and I bring that up because I think it's interesting during this time, this period where we're rededicating the temple through Chanukah Bayit. It feels to me like a lot of a lot of the biographers, for example, have mentioned that he loved to read Isaiah in the Hebrew with his grandfather Sar Hadik who was in his living in his mother's home at the time. But I think he was very comfortable and influenced a lot by other modalities of scripture, and especially in this song about the vision of Lamentations, and especially that that moment. There's the very searing line where the father or the God figure is turning back to the singer when the singer demands to see the face of this remarkable figure. The singer cries out that I want a face that's fair this time. I want a spirit that is calm. And the response is, I never turned aside. I never walked away. It was you who built the temple. It was you who covered up my face. Just really a very interesting way of looking at the destruction of the temple, and also the rededication of that as a process also of inward turning. Remember the story when we were at AJS in LA a few moons ago when you got to sit beside him on his right hand side? Was there
Yes.
a story you want to share about Hanukkah that may be
Well,
salient?
he was telling me that he was up in the monastery on Mount Baldy, and he said, well, some Lubavitchers came up. They heard there was a Yidla on the mountain, and they came up, and the menorah was burning very low, and they came in and saw, and they were sort of comforted. That's the way he sort of told the story. But uh, he definitely, I mean, people said in his cell in Mount Baldy, in his little hut, that the only really things that there was a synthesizer, and there was a menorah, and there was some other piece of Judaica, and that was what he took for that life.
Yeah, so despite the love of that kind of discipline and the austerity, it is interesting to see that if you had to go and spend a very long period of retreat up in a monastery on top of a hill named Mount Baldy, what would you take with you? That's what he took with him.
Right.
Pretty
That's what he took for
fascinating.
them. Yes.
So
Yes.
I also brought up this point as well because we're going to see as we just close on the song, "Lover, Lover, Lover," and also its Hebrew reception, not just within Matti Freidman's new book, but also Shai Tsabari, the popular Paitanan singer in Israel, has adapted "Lover, Lover, Lover" in an interesting way that I'll get to in just a moment. But I think it's what's interesting about the song is to think about who the singer is addressing in terms of the call and the response to come back to me. Of course, there's always the lover and the beloved, and as you said, Pinchas, it's always about relationships that of love and brokenness, and then the need to try to rebuild that covenant in some way. That he really became, in many ways, the expert writer of this manual for living with defeat, as he liked to say.
Mm-hmm.
But here, I thought it was interesting that the destruction of the temple and really looking at the temple here is is this imagined conversation between the singer and God who says, "It was you who built the temple, and it was you who covered my face." That there's something about the inner relationship to the inner temple and the outward manifestation of the things that we build, the institutions that we create, the brick and mortar and the spirit and the struggle that he had as a seeker to try to find that spirit inside of the institutions in Montreal in which he grew up, and the search that took him far and wide to Israel and beyond to be able to find a way to connect to that place of inspiration. And I was thinking a lot about the way that he changed the lyrics when originally he was. In the line we looked at earlier, referring to the soldiers, and then shifting from the soldiers to the address between the father and the son, or the father and the singer. But there's something as well that the Torah Tamima brought up that was a really interesting remark that caught my attention, that I bring up over here. L'shever bachurai, matzinu shesiluk shel bachurim kashe kechorban beit hamikdash. I think part of what he's mourning here is that in reality, the sacrifice of soldiers in this war, this horrific war that took place on the most sacred of days in the Jewish calendar. The sacrifice was also just the loss of human life, and of the ability to be able to be in love with life and in love with humanity. And I think he's
Well, so
also
let me
lamenting
just
that as well.
hold for a second. The 19th century commentator on the Torah has said that the loss of life is the loss of the lives in war is worse than the destruction of the temple. So for all that we mourn the destruction of the temple uh, this totem, this monach, this central issue in Jewish lore. In fact, the death of the soldiers has come to replace, is identified as the harder pain.
That's what it seems like. That's my intuition, and I
Yeah.
thought it was curious if that's a possible reading of this song and the change of the lyrics. It's interesting to see when we get to the way Shai Tsabari translated it into Hebrew, the choice that he uses for lover, because it's speaking about lover and not the beloved. So we'll take a look and pay attention to that when we get to the translation. I also noticed recently that. You Want It Darker as well. It just came out of Makor Rishon in translation in Israel. So there is an ongoing love affair with Leonard Cohen, as Matti Freidman has discerned, and it's interesting to think about those places where his music and the legend and the lore of the work that he has done continues to to resonate. And I thought also some more just about this lyric, just playing a little bit of riffing through Chazal and some of the rabbinics that may have been emerging through the palette that he's painting from. The This whole idea of having the face of the divine covered up. It's interesting. I thought to myself, why would a poet suggest that God looks at the work that he has done, or that humanity has done, he or she has done, to suggest that you're covering up the divine face? Where are the places, and what are the reasons why God's face needs to be covered? And there's this beautiful image in Chagiga 5b in the Babylonian Talmud, where we actually look at the quality of the tears that cover up the face of the Holy One. And I thought about that in terms of the place where the tears emerge, and the rabbis here are going through this whole back and forth about whether or not God cries in the outer chambers, the chambers of the temple, or only on the inner side of the temple itself. And just to think about the teardrops and the need to cover the 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 divine face, as it were, from human visibility. Oftentimes we think about it, it's because it's just something that, as we know, when Moses asks to see God's face, um, "Harini nat kvodecha," show me your glory, which really may be a need that every poet has and every prophet has, to be able to see the source of inspiration. We know the response. right? Lo yareni ha'adam v'chai. You can't see me and live. But the rabbis, I think, offer this really interesting and playful way of opening that up and suggesting, well, there's some times where God is actually crying with us or over us or to us, and it's not always clear how many of those tears we can actually absorb and really handle because of the intensity of the emotion. And I was struck by that when he uh, he has this verse about you who built the temple and it was you who covered up my face. I was beginning to imagine why the face needs to be covered, and I thought a lot about those tears, and especially during war, there is an element where the destruction of human life is something that gives God a great sense of suffering. We see it in
Mhm.
the Pesach Haggadah that he knew about, and it's interesting that the whole issue of Hallelujah and the Hallel interruptus that takes place on the Seder where it's broken. The famous midrash of the rabbis is clear that the reason why God tells the angels to stop singing Hallelujah within the course of Hallel is because God's creatures are suffering, and when God's creatures suffer, we have to break the Hallel. That may also be part of the cold and the broken
Mhm.
Hallelujah.
Mhm. This is an
There,
interesting critique in this section that you just brought up.
yeah. So do you want to read it and tell me what you see? It's a
Your
beautiful
righteous
one. This is
enemy
number
is
27.
listening. He hears your anthems full of blood and vanity, and your children singing to themselves. He has overturned the vehicle of nationhood. He has spilled the precious cargo, and every nation he has taken back, because you are swollen with your little time, because you do not wrestle with your angel, because you dare to live without God, because your cowardice has led you to believe that the victor does not limp. So I guess he's criticizing a triumphalism that he feels takes leave of something that's intent, inside the tropes that are intrinsically Jewish. Okay, that there's with the nationhood, the secular ideal of triumphalist nationhood in Zionism, which leads to people, the losing track of the central understandings they should have.
I guess that's one of the dangers and part of the place where his heart is torn because he clearly has such a deep and abiding love, both for the particularity of Israel and its need for survival and also for justice. And that dialectic, that tension, is one that he expresses in powerful ways, both in the song as well as later on. This is already many years later in '84, where he's still reflecting on this, and you see it come up time and time again in different places. So here's the rendering of Shai Tsabari, and it's really interesting that if you take a look at the chorus, the way that it's translated, I'm not sure if Kobe Maidan had his hand in this or not. He's the preeminent translator of Leonard Cohen into Hebrew, and I had an interesting conversation interview with him when I first launched the book when I was touring it. I had a chance to actually take it into conversation with him in Israel, and he has really succeeded in rendering a lot of this into singable Hebrew. So when Shai Sabari sings this, the chorus of "Lover, lover, 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 come back to me" is here rendered as "Ana, ana, 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 ahuva na chizri elai." That's the way that it's rendered. So what do you notice in the
Meaning
choice?
whence.
It could be
What's
the whence, or it could also be it's like the oh that it can't be.
please?
It's the please. It's a kind of like a
The
petition.
plea word, Anna, please,
Yeah,
please, please. Yeah.
yeah.
My
I think it's
beloved, come
and the,
back to me.
and so that's see you picked it up. You immediately caught it. That's what's interesting is that the rendering here is beloved come back to me as opposed to lover, because if you're translating it into Hebrew, how would you choose a translation of lover rather than beloved?
Right.
It should be ahuv, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
that's the part that's interesting. So that it comes back for me, it raised the question. Once I saw this translation, I started asking myself, is the call towards is it the masculine crying out to the feminine beloved that is so much a part of songs like Suzanne and Marianne and Chelsea Hotel? Or is this a different call, a call of the poet as warrior to the love that's shared with other human beings, namely the other soldiers?
So when do you want to play the part of the clips, Aubrey?
Let's talk a little bit more
Okay. Okay.
and see where.
Because at some point I want to talk about Montreal.
Well, why don't you maybe let's take a moment and divert into Montreal now, and then we'll come back to a clip or two.
Well, you've invoked Montreal. I first read Beautiful Losers, which is set in Montreal in the late 60s when the Parti Québécois was doing all these terrorist activities and so on and so forth, and really captured
During the October crisis, yeah,
the
1970.
the moody nature of Montreal and what it's like. And I'm sure it was even more bleak in those days. It's also a very sensual kind of gratification oriented type of city. So it's an interesting place. And I told him that Beautiful Losers had sort of set me up for living in Montreal. But at the same time,
You told Cohen this. This is when you were talking to
yes,
him in
yes,
that
yes,
conversation in Los Angeles.
right.
Okay.
But uh, but from Leonard Cohen to you, and with many, many stops in between, people too numerous to name, there's tremendous self-obsession about the Jews of Montreal and a
Why do you
fetish
think that is, Pinchas? What is
because
that
of every
self-obsession about?
every brick in Outremont has, you know, a story behind it. If you're a real Montrealer. I once heard an academic paper given by a very hip man about a hip young man, the glasses, the jacket, everything about the observance of the kosher laws in Montreal in the pre-war period. And the denouement of the paper was, and then they fired the butcher. And all the Montreal Jews sitting around at the American Academy of Religion gasped and said, they fired the butcher? Like that was it. So there's this Montreal quality, and it comes up very much in your book, Tangle of Matter and Ghosts, your book about Leonard Cohen, which I have devoured as well. They circling back to certain totems of Montreal life, including a certain Hasidic Rebbe, the Tosha Rebbe, that the Jewish scholars of Montreal love to write about their indigenous Rebbe, the Tosha Rebbe, and his ascetic life and practices. So I just want to say that there's a kind of Montreal lends itself to a very internalized kind of obsession, and I'm also obsessed with my hometown, but of Cocoa Beach, Florida. But would you like to speak to that since I've called you out?
Yes, I think it's a great observation. Just to clarify, I was born as a Canadian, so born in Toronto, but my heart was always in Montreal, primarily because of the connection with both Leonard Cohen and who really was more of my inspiration to become to follow the rabbinic path than the Tosha Rebbe was. I discovered the Boisbriand legend of the Tosha Rebbe much later on. And in the book, one of the things that I struggle with is to try to discern whether there is something called Canadian Jewish mysticism. Does it really exist? Is there something both within the fabric of the Great White North and its landscape that lends itself for a deeper sense of exile, focus on exile and alienation and solitude? Given that the third solitude is really something that typifies the Jewish experience of writers and poets and artists in Montreal. So it's
May I
something that
interrupt you for a second?
of course.
I'd like to point out to the listeners that um, Rabbi Glazer has already founded a school of study in the study of Jewish mysticism, namely the School of the Expatriate Hasidic rabbis of the second generation who found their way to the land of Israel and encountered possibly certain Sufi elements and that kind of thing. But it's what we call the Tiberian school, the people that lived in Tiberias really very early in the 19th century, in the early 19th, beginning of the 19th century. So when you say that there's a specific Montreal brand of Jewish mysticism, you're already coming as somebody who has identified and founded an area-based school of thought in the history of Kabbalah. I just wanted to point that out.
Yes, no, I appreciate that, Pinchas. Thank you. It's a, again, it's an argument that sometimes can feel like it's a little bit of only academic of interest to academics alone. But my passion for the 1777 Aliyah of the Kalisker and Vitebsker Rebbe to from Eastern Europe to eventually settle in Tiberias, and the kind of conscious community that they created there, and the fellowship based on love was one that really is continues to be very inspiring to me. And so I venture through these different time periods, and I guess what you're pointing to is something that I need to give some more thought to, is why it is that I'm looking for these exemplars. And if I find it in Tiberias in 1777, and then I'm able to find it as well in a small cluster in Montreal. I mean, the truth is that the comparisons, the richness of the comparisons that I began with, in comparing the kind of post-secular mysticism of Leonard Cohen and putting that into conversation with the Tosher Rebbe, would make both of their heads spin, or at least they'd be smiling from their graves. But I did it because, to me, there's something interesting about that kind of conversation that emerges when you juxtapose things that emerged in the same landscape but may not necessarily have been in direct contact with each other. It's part of the aroma of the place. And I speak about it as well, even with the work I've done on the Baal Shem Tov, in terms of the founder of the Hasidic movement, his relationship and the what I call the devotional sociabilities. That is, that in a certain place, whether or not people are conscious of it, there is a certain zeitgeist, there's a movement of the spirit that happens that sometimes inspires, takes hold, cross-pollinates, and finds its way into the work of great poets, mystics, singers, songwriters, and it's interesting. I referred back to Cohen as he describes himself as living a life as a monk with benefits. And it's interesting that you notice the extreme asceticism of the Tosher Rebbe. That was one of the things that I compared in both in the book as well as elsewhere. Is this really interesting relationship between, when we talk about asceticism, it really means about depriving the body of certain kinds of things. And Judaism has a long history, especially in its mystical tradition, of ascetic practices. Um, and and Cohen walks this fine line in so much of his creative process between delving into ascetic practices, like when he was on Hydra and writing Beautiful Losers. There's accounts of him having fasted for many days on end to go into kind of trance-like states to get into the space of the creative process. But the aesthetic experiences that he looks for and that he cultivates also deepen his relationship to, and his falling into eroticism. So there's an interesting kind of relationship between the two, and that's where the conversation I thought was most interesting, in terms of juxtaposing these two mystical masters, both of them from areas around Montreal,
Right,
that were
right.
worthy of a further conversation. Um, this is a great little juxtaposition here. Both this portrait that graces downtown Montreal, one of two of them painted onto a building, that began to emerge with his passing, and then this photo that I like, that comes from doing zazen in the Mount Baldy
Hmm.
space, really in the monastery, really in many ways I think kind of captures this very fascinating personality, who also has really, in many ways, captivated our attention. And what I wanted to try to show tonight really was, and to bring to our attention, you can read about it more in the book, and there's going to be another book that's following. So, Pinchas, we know that there is, as Kohelet says, there's no shortage of books, but you're at an amazing bookstore in downtown Los Angeles that really celebrates the love of books and book culture. And you and I have a deep and abiding love for books and for book culture. I was very inspired by many of your writings, including your work on the Kabbalists of Beit El in the period that you wrote. That was a really again, it's a fascinating look at a community of mystics, and the question that I try to deal with in this book, and I'm also thinking about in this song, that really has come back to me in a much more sustained way since I wrote Tangle of Matter and Ghosts, and I think it's going to have to appear in another book that I'm now reflecting on, and Gary knows about this in terms of death, dying, and self-mourning practices. What happens to us and what happens to art when it's able to reflect this confrontation with our own mortality, and when we're really forced to look at the inner lights. And I think Hanukkah is a time to look deeper into those inner lights, the stories that you share with us, Pinchas, especially if you can imagine now this image in the monastery of Eliezer ben Nisan v'Masha HaKohen, Nisan HaKohen v'Masha, Zichron Livracha, sitting and doing his zazen, but always having the lights of the Chanukiah burning beside him, and really, reflecting on the trajectory of our lives, but always knowing that we have the capacity to uncover that deeper light. For me, that's
Hmm.
something that really shines through very strong. And it's a time that we think about rededicating that inner temple that he was struggling with throughout his life. And it really came into deep focus for him, I think, during that period where he was drawn to take leave and leap from Hydra. And somehow there's very little. It's interesting in Matti Freidman's book, which I've just started to take a look at. There's very little in the IDF archives that actually even records this encounter, aside from that shot that I shared at the opening. There's actually very little. See if I can go back to it, but there's very little in the archives um, of the IDF that actually can really share with us much of what it was that was going on at that period. And every time, here's the shot. Every time we go back, and I'm sure many of you can probably identify many of those who are in this specific shot.
Yeah, Eric Sharon, of course.
You can see Sharon, right? Sharon over there.
Matti Caspi is his accompanist.
That's right. Very good.
Very, sort
And
of
then a few others
very
from the
pop
musical
star.
troupe.
Yeah.
But I think
So,
it's an interesting thing for us all to reflect on, and I wanted to bring that back to you to see if there's anything else in terms of your own personal journey. You spent time living in Israel. You encountered him at Binyanei HaOmah, and then many years later
time
in Los Angeles.
yeah, time in New York, or time, hither and yon. Um, no, I think this is just very interesting that Ruth Weiss wrote a really sort of a little bit of a catty article. I forget where, in Commentary or something, about the early days of being a Montreal intellectual and post-war with Leonard Cohen, and how inured she was to his charms and that kind of thing, and said a couple of things that were he told me were rather painful about some of the friends that he had, and the ends that they came to. But then she couldn't help but say, but of all the people in Montreal at that time, Leonard Cohen was the most unapologetically out and Jewish of all of them. There was no cringing attempt to be any less Jewish than he was, and he wore it as a badge of honor from his position of hegemony as a young Canadian poet. And that's an interesting thing. And I think that um, we had a very uncomplicated support of Israel and support of Zionism in those days. And if you have the broad perspective, you can continue to have an uncomplicated view of Israel and its relationship to the Jews and its role in Jewish culture, which he was very acutely aware of, even when he, didn't always necessarily reflect it. His friendship with the premier Jewish intellectual Leon Wieseltier, that he dedicated a song to, one of his songs. I'm blocking it out, but it's dedicated to LW.
Right.
Thousand Kisses Deep. That's it. So he really always moved very easily and very boldly in that quality, and was never less than that. And that's something we really have to prize now. as the community descends into mutual recrimination and suspicion and um, generational divide and so on and so forth, that he really was much more, once again, toho kavaro, as the Talmud says, integrated within and without. And that's sort of the point that I want to make, that at various times he ran to Israel to play concerts, and when one would have thought that Israel had pariah status in the general world, he was completely out there, you
Yeah,
know.
I think it's a great way to look at his light because he was nuanced and complex. But as Ruth, for those of you who don't know, Ruth Weiss was part of this circle. Her brother David Roskies was one of my teachers when I studied at JTS at the
Yeah,
Jewish
mine as
Theological
well.
Seminary. So it's interesting that Ruth made that kind of observation, and that we do have a need to learn from his light, and the fact that he was able to shapeshift through so many of these different loves, and to be unabashedly able to throw himself into those passions, and also to find the suffering and the pain and the empathy, and again to return, to come from a place of love, to go through whatever ruptures took place, to know that with the cracks and everything, not only does more light come through, but I think for him also more love emerged, that the love was more whole amidst its brokenness. So I want to turn just for the last few minutes to some of the folks that are here. If you have any questions for myself or for Pinchas, I know
Well,
there's
we
a lot
can
of
check the
lovers
chat.
of Leonard Cohen here, and let's take a look at the chat and see. But also feel free to put up an emoji or just raise your hand, and we'll be glad to share in closing conversation with you.
um yeah, what's the third solitude? Did you invoke that,
Right.
Aubrey?
So I did invoke that. It's an interesting thing in Canadian Jewish literature that's spoken about oftentimes, and especially describes and is related to writers that are living in Montreal that experience it very deeply. That the first solitude comes up by being in a Canadian landscape, and then the second emerges as the separation from. So that's the separation of Canada from the rest of the map, especially from America, and then moving from there to another level of solitude, separating the Anglophone from the Francophone community, and then as the Jewish question comes up, it leads to a kind of third solitude. So these many, it wasn't just Cohen, but there were a number of them that experienced this condition of being writing or creating from a place of the third solitude, and it's been reflected on and studied in different capacities. But I think it is kind of interesting because Leonard was interested in his solitude, and he played in between those different levels of solitude. And then also, of course, as you mentioned, in Beautiful Losers, he introduces even more solitude in terms of the indigenous culture here, and tries to come to terms with what now we know was a real catastrophe in terms of where where Canada stands in terms of its record with the residential schools. And he maybe was intuiting that a little bit by planting some seeds in terms of trying to uncover the layers of the relationships, in terms of the promises, the love that is sought, the love that was broken, the covenants that were broken, and the ways that the tikkun might be able to emerge. That's one of the things that I've noticed in comparing Leonard Cohen to, let's say, his partner in that car ride through the Pacific Coast Highway, Bob Dylan. That Dylan just sees everything as dark and getting darker, but Leonard always held out the possibility that things could reach a place of tikkun, right? That if there is a crack in everything, there is still light that can get in. Dylan was much darker than that. Topic for a different conversation, but I've noticed in reflecting, especially on their later works, when they confront their own mortality, that Dylan just keeps getting darker, but that Leonard always holds out the possibility, even though when he says in that final song, "You want it darker, we killed the flame," at least there still is a flame and there is still a candle and there is a little bit of luminosity amidst all the darkness. And I think that's something that's really